So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, as we said, is Friday, March the 26th, and we are going to continue to talk about biodiversity. So I shared this TEK. So the state of Texas wants to make sure that you are able to describe how does that biodiversity, and remember we said biodiversity means lots of different living things, continues to the sustainability of an ecosystem, how having lots of different living things can help an ecosystem continue and not die out. And we broke down the word, bio meaning life, diversity meaning variety or different. So it is when we have to acknowledge just how many different life forms there are on our planet. It's just incredible. And it's all based on the variety of genes within a species, the different species that live in any one place, and then all the places that there are to live on our planet, the different ecosystems. And just kind of continuing what we covered last week on the flow of energy is how everything is connected because of this energy that flows through, beginning with the producers onto the primary consumers, the herbivores, and then, of course, the carnivores and omnivores at the top of a food chain. And then how at the end the decomposers break everything down and all those molecules have a chance to start all over again. That's something else. So those are the notes that you'll find in the interactive notebook. But of course, you can always just come back to the slides as well to look for information. So let us watch this film.
Our planet's diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem like permanent fixtures, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can become deserts, and reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. What makes one ecosystem strong and another weak in the face of change? The answer, to a large extent, is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes. Species that lack genetic diversity due to isolation or low population numbers are much more vulnerable to fluctuations caused by climate change, disease, or habitat fragmentation. Whenever a species disappears because of its weakened gene pool, a knot is untied and parts of the net disintegrate. So, what if we were to remove one species from the rainforest? Would the system fall apart? Probably not. The volume of species, their genetic diversity, and the complexity of the ecosystems form such rich biodiversity in this forest that one species gap in the weave won't cause it to unravel. The forest can stay resilient and recover from change. But that's not true in every case. In some environments, taking away just one important component can undermine the entire system. Take coral reefs, for instance. Many organisms in a reef are dependent on the coral. It provides key microhabitats shelter, and breeding grounds for thousands of species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Corals also form interdependent relationships with fungi and bacteria. The coral itself is a loom that allows the tangled net of biodiversity to be woven. That makes coral a keystone organism, one that many others depend on for their survival. So what happens when destructive fishing practices, pollution, and ocean acidification weaken coral or even kill it altogether? Exactly what you might think. The loss of this keystone species leaves its dependents at a loss too, threatening the entire fabric of the reef. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity together form the complex tangled weave of biodiversity that is vital for the survival of organisms on Earth. We humans are woven into this biodiversity too. When just a few strands are lost, our own well-being is threatened. Cut too many links, and we risk unraveling it all. What the future brings is unpredictable, but biodiversity can give us an insurance policy, Earth's own safety net, to safeguard our survival.
Alrighty, so let's look at exactly what all those different types of diversities that she mentioned in that video, that there are ecosystem diversity, there's species diversity, and genetic diversity. And let's start with, and again, this is just some other graphics that I found of, there's genetic diversity, and these little things, at first I thought they looked like batteries or something, but they're supposed to be chromosomes. There's genetic diversity, species diversity. So genetic diversity is, it may all be the same species, but they're all different genetically. In species diversity, we see that there are different organisms that live within an area. And then in ecosystem diversity is, as you know, we have different ecosystems throughout our planet. And we're going to look at each one of those a little closer. So ecosystem diversity, you're probably most familiar with this when you studied this in elementary, and last year I think a little bit in 6th grade. But it is just the huge range of ecosystems that we have on our planet. Now these are like the major ecosystems, because even within a small area, a pond somewhere, that's a whole ecosystem in itself. And that little ecosystem of this pond and the plants around it and the animals that live in it, it is part of a bigger ecosystem. And it may be in any one of these that are shown up here. So ecosystem diversity is just that. Our planet has many different ecosystems scattered throughout our planet, and it's based mostly on the proximity to the equator and the further you are from the equator, because it's all tied in with temperature as well. So again, many different ecosystems can be found throughout the planet. And even if we just looked at the state of Texas, you can see, and I want to say maybe this is 5th grade or 4th grade, y'all talked a little bit about the ecoregions of Texas, so we can break it down even further. Species diversity. So species diversity is, what are the different animals, how many different types of animals are there within an ecosystem? And the more, the better, okay? So there's two things they look at when we're talking about species diversity. One is, what are the different types of animals and how many different types of animals do you have? And then how many of each of those animals do you have? If you had an ecosystem and you only had one of each animal, well, you may have a lot of different species, but if you only have one of each, there's no richness to there. There's no one's going to be breeding and making more, because if there's only one of each. So in species diversity is just that. What are the different species that live within a given area? Now, obviously, they just kind of put all these pictures together, and polar bears don't live where elephants live or whatever. But it's just trying to make the point of all the different animals, or it can be all the different plants that live within an area. So in species diversity, we're looking at the number and the variety of animals. So are there 5 different types of animals, or are there 100 different types of animals? And what we find in species diversity is, and this was in the little film yesterday, is the closer you are to the equator, the more different kind of animals you find in a, let's say, a 5-mile radius. There's just a lot more diversity near the equator because the living is a little easier there. We have, the most sunshine at the equator, so we have the more number of plants because there's high energy there, and that leads to there being more animals as well. The further you get away from the equator, the less number of species and the less number of, that type of species living there. There's just less animals because it's harder to live in the Arctic than it is at the equator. So, it's all the different animals that may live in a given ecosystem. And again, this is just a mashup because they're just really cute. I use them. And then we have genetic diversity. So genetic diversity is you may have frogs, but you may have frogs in your ecosystem. Let me get rid of that. But we don't want them to be all clones. We want there to be genetic diversity. I mentioned that, I think, to one of my classes yesterday, that in Colombia, the fungus that I mentioned yesterday that has invaded the Americas and is killing frogs by the thousands. In Colombia, their national symbol is a little frog. And this frog, it's a real frog that lives in the Amazon area there in the jungles of Colombia, is dying by the thousands. So what the government decided to do is that I'm going to say, and I'm making up a number, but they gathered 10,000 frogs that were healthy, free of the fungus. And they put them in a clean, secluded, like a laboratory, with the hope that the fungus will have its run through the country and eventually die out, and then they'll be able to release these frogs that they've been protecting out into the wild to repopulate the country with them. So that sounds like a terrific idea, but the reality is that one of the things that they had to admit and that the challenge they're going to face is that there's only going to be 10,000 different possibility of genetic material of genetic variation, where if it were in the wild there'd probably be millions, but it was the best they could do to save this little national treasure of theirs. So in genetic diversity, we want to make sure that the animals that are the same kind of animal that live in a given area have different genes. And that's always better than clones that can all get wiped out. If one gets sick, they all get sick and they all die. So we want genetic diversity within the individual species. So this is something that I did not know, and I don't know if y'all knew, that there are different types of giraffes. And there are different types, and it's due to their markings on their coats and stuff, and I guess I never noticed that they're different. And I think up to not long ago, they thought they were all the same, but that their coats just developed differently, like humans, that we have different skin color, different hair color, texture, and so forth. But I think they're actually finding out there are actually different species that they only breed within. The Rothschild would only breed with the Rothschild. So that was interesting to learn. But we want diversity. We want there to be differences. Those genes make those organisms stronger. The same thing. We were debating whether this was genetic difference or this is species difference. And I think it's kind of in between because they are now separated. They're the same genus. They're the same genus of being crocodilians, but look at all the different types of crocodiles there are. So it is a good thing. It would be better to have different types of crocodiles living in one place, because then if something happens to this type of crocodile, then these others are able to still play their role as a top predator. But that's not true. Actually, these crocodiles all live in different places throughout the planet. But the point still remains that what is better is to have different genes rather than the same. We see, these are all the same species. Dogs are all the same species, but they genetically they're different. And you hear all the time that mutts are the healthiest type of dogs because they have a mixture of all these different genes that sometimes make them just much more resilient to disease than purebreds. But we see this in humans as well, that genetically we are all different, and that's a good thing. Because an illness, we see COVID. Some people are never going to get COVID. They're still going to get vaccinated because you can't be sure, but there are some people who probably would never get COVID, and that's a good thing. Those are the genes we want to go and pass on. And in the past, when there was giant, plagues, the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague, millions of people died. There was no intervention there like vaccinations. But some people survived, and they went on to pass their genes that made them resilient to some of those diseases. So genetic diversity is great within a given species. Within an ecosystem, we want to have a diverse number and types of animals. And having diversity in our ecosystem is really what allows these different animals to become. And then within those animals, the genetic differences. That's all good. So this is the part of the notes that are going to go into the interactive notebook. And that's the end of the notes for today.